balanced than you, I noticed, by the way. Nicer colour cast. I don't know. I've got sunlight. I guess that's the difference.
I thought it was you're a professional.
No, a little bit of foundation. Good morning, Alec. I shall be teaching you how to prepare for a Zoom cast.
That would be great, Simon. So, hello, everyone. No one's actually watching yet, but someone's watching. So I'm here with Simon Evans, who is a comedian, writer, radio broadcaster.
I am.
Wannabe genius, if you read the reviews of your show in Scotland.
Yeah, don't know if you saw that one, but that was a couple of years ago. Yeah, I was investigating what it took, what the missing ingredient was, but I'm not sure I really found it. Eccentricity, that seemed to be the key.
Yeah, because I saw that about the John Stuart Mill thing.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And he said,
I don't know whether it's interesting. Only one other person that used to get a lot of people in the audience go. I'd read out a bit in from his, as you wrote, from On Liberty, where he sort of goes, you know, the great thing that society, the responsibility that society has is to embrace and encourage eccentrics. To you know, the more outliers you have, the more healthy the mental state of society generally will be.
Right.
And I read that out, and the audience were all going, "Oh, yeah, that's very true." Yes. Because it's got this kind of weight of Victorian, you know. One bloke said to me afterwards, a guy called Chris Snowden, you might even know him, he lives in Shoreham, he's a sort of economist, but he's very anti-nanny state. He is like quite an eccentric guy himself. He campaigns against even like plain pack tobacco and stuff like that, you know. But he said he'd written a blog about that quote, in which he goes, let's actually investigate to see whether this appears to be true. And according to him, it really isn't. There's no correlation at all.
Because it kind of reminds me of, there's a quote from Hamlet where it's like, above all, to your own self be true. But
yeah.
It's bollocks because it's Polonius.
Yeah.
And it's like...
It's a pompous idiot saying it, yeah.
Yeah. So it's right, you've got to kiss everyone's ass and do this and be nice to everyone and do all this. Above all, to your own self be true. Yeah,
it's just full of hot air, isn't it? It's just all the advice that you give to your son when he goes off to university that you know he'll ignore, you know, and you just have to. The thing is, you have to learn all advice the hard way. No advice ever works, does it? All it does is for the benefit of whoever's giving it to hear themselves, kind of going, "Oh yes, I seem to have accrued some wisdom."
You know what my biggest mistake was, and you're going to make it too, but at least I've told you about it. Yeah. So we're just talking about the death of the high street and the rise of the coffee and cake shop.
Yeah, I think Brighton is ahead of the curve because I think 99% of high street, you know, premises were under they were on the knife edge already economically before coronavirus, right? A lot of them are just going to be absolutely screwed by this. And but Brighton has always had this kind of it's quite anti-fragile in a way. Brighton, it is quite able to, you know, to dodge and swing and pivot. I think it might already have found the way because essentially, you know, the what used to be retail premises in Brighton have been colonised by coffee shops for ages, you know, for years.
Yeah,
and we all know that coffee is not, you know, it's like you spend £3 on about, you know, 15 pence worth of milk and coffee beans. You're basically paying for an hour's worth of Wi-Fi and some second-hand furniture, aren't you? And a little bit of a vibe, you know. But even though that's, hey,
someone's putting in the comments and charity shops as well. Yeah,
well, sadly after 2008, I mean, we lost a handful of really annoying middle class nonsense like sort of champagne and cheese shops and stuff. It was pretty bad. But they were largely taken over by tattoo parlors and vaping shops. You know, that was a bit distressing, you know.
Tattoo parlors as well. God.
Yeah. Well, it's anything you can't feasibly do online, isn't it, basically? But my vision of the future is you create a premises, might be quite specific. I mean, your place might be one of these where people can go to do their online shopping, but in an environment where it's actually quite where there's a little bit of a community who want to do that together. Do you see what I mean? So it's not like the old EasyJet internet cafes or anything, but you take your own laptop or even just your own phone or iPad or whatever. You sit in a cafe, and you might think, I want to buy a new pair of football boots. But this might be like a kind of sports cafe where there's just like, you know, people who know about football boots or whatever just hang out, or if fans of that kind of, or just like a general purpose cafe. Yeah. But if you order from within that premises, you know, like if you have a website and you have links to products you've reviewed or whatever, you get a little kickback from Amazon if they buy via your link, right? That's how the whole thing works. So you just do that, but it's geo-specific. So it's on your laptop, but Amazon know that you were in that cafe.
Wow.
So you just get that little bit of capacity to actually kind of get out of your house. Nobody wants to live in a post-coronavirus world where we just live in our houses and we take deliveries all day. But the high street can no longer really offer, you know, a sensible alternative to online shopping. It's already been screwed. So that would be a way forward, I think, possibly. I mean, to take these a little bit of tweaking, but that's my...
It's a bit like Argos.
Hey?
A bit like Argos. You can go in and look at stuff.
Right, exactly. Middle-class Argos, yeah. Argos with better coffee. Yeah, exactly.
Argos with better coffee. Right. What else are we going to talk about? We didn't even chat about what we're going to talk about. So I've been looking through stuff. So whenever I do a podcast, sometimes I learned this the hard way at the start. I'd interview like black belts in jiu-jitsu that have been training for 20 years. And I'd go like, right, let's talk about this and this and this. And they'd be like, no, that's not it. And I have this like, no, not really. I just do this. Like, oh, okay. I want to talk about mastery and like, whether they achieve states of flow. They're like, no, I just kind of do my thing. So I was going to talk about like again, mastery. I love a bit of mastery, but as a comedian,
Green, that one.
Sorry?
Robert Greene.
What? Which one? Which?
The 48 Laws of Power and all that. He's got a book on mastery, isn't he?
I think.
That guru guy. Do you know about that? The 48 Laws of Power. He's written about 3 or 4. One of them is called Masteries. I've written that. I read that one. It wasn't very useful. It was all Polonius stuff.
Well, so I was going to talk to you as a veteran comedian.
Yeah.
If that's not offensive. Like
grey beard, no hair, veteran.
There you go. Or the fact that you can go on YouTube and see versions of you that are like at least 20 years younger. So
that's true. Yeah.
Like deconstruction of the art, and it's the same with like a musician or stuff. And I want to talk about working the crowd and losing the crowd, and how much unconscious competence, or just like, you know, I just know what to do now. I don't think about the ebb and the flow of a script or a set. I don't know, I was going to talk about that, but then, like I said, when I tried that before, it doesn't really work. So.
Well, I will offer this. I have discovered since the lockdown, quite a few comedy clubs have tried to create online offers and just continue to some sort of connection with their audience. And so they've asked comedians to contribute a minute or two, and you send it in on WhatsApp or whatever. And they say, stand in your own front room, you know, and have a beer on the go and just be like a garrulous, chatty sort of, you know, bit of company at the bar kind of vibe. And it is incredibly difficult. It's so hard to create the same flow and persona and confidence and rhythm that you do when you have an audience, you know, to play off. And it makes you realize just how much a part of a larger organism you are as a comedian. You think you're on the stage in a comedy club and you think you are the big focus of attention. You think you're dominating the room. You think, you know, like it's an audience with. And in reality, you realize just how much, you know, your viability in that role depends on constant feedback mechanisms from all around, like the lights, the stage, the amplification, the arrangement, the dynamics of the room is so important. And without that, you just look like an utter fool. And a lot of the funniest content that's been circulated during coronavirus, I'm sure you're on the WhatsApp groups that just send each other all these memes, and a lot of them are unbelievably brilliant, like the one with the guys carrying the coffin and stuff. You know, there's some really, really funny stuff circulating, and none of it is coming from professional comedians. It's a completely different medium, and they have no idea how to operate it. They're sharing it, but they haven't created any of it. I don't know who is creating them. I don't know whether it's like just my guess would be like 18-year-olds, you know, just really digital natives, really comfortable with the technology and everything. A lot of the TikTok stuff is just genius, you know, but it's a completely different medium, and you just realize how sort of situation specific the set of skills that I've accumulated over 20 years are. So what I've sort of tried to do, to cope with that, is actually create new personae that aren't like I am on stage, which I'm afraid would just expose who I am on stage as being not quite as strong and as, you know, as convincing as I'd hoped it would be, which is, you know, is a different way of approaching it. So it's sort of creating a characters almost, you know, who are the sort of people like a sort of Cockney estate agent. Like, you might know that little bloke who presents the daytime programs about how not to get burgled and stuff. I can't remember his name. You know the guy I mean? He's a little cockney. I think he is an ex-burglar, and so ITV got him to present shows about how to make sure your windows are safe and stuff. And he's a great TV presenter, but he's one of these guys who talk right down the lens of the camera at you, you know, and he's like really confident about that, you know. And I'm not that sort of person. I never have been. When you're on stage, it's a different thing. You can adopt a sort of, you know, I might as well be, I don't know, who was that fellow who used to wear the cravat in the sitcoms with Windsor Davis? You know, that, do you remember there was a chalk and cheese or whatever? You know, and Spitting Image were convinced he was always after a knighthood. Right. But anyway, those, you know, some old character like that, well, they're not comfortable with shouting down a lens, you know, so you have to come up with something different for online stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the thing. Like, you can see, like, I've done my research this week, watching different interviews of you and watching you're doing stand up, and you can, you've got a different persona with each thing. So, yeah, talking about
it changed. I mean, I've already been through a couple of changes. I've been doing it for over 20 years now, and I don't know that it's conscious, but I think most stand-ups do kind of reinvent themselves every so often. You almost like you reach the end of a certain, you know, you're really wringing it out of the rag after a certain point, you know, and you kind of think there must be something else. And luckily for me, after about 10 years, I was like 96, I started. In 2003, my first daughter was born. And, you know, so marriage and fatherhood kind of changed my direction quite a lot. And previously to that, I'd just been this quite arrogant, superior, you know, stainless steel, you know, nothing was going to touch me. I could look down my nose at the whole of society and how they were going wrong. And then suddenly overnight, I became a bloke who was bullied, harassed, you know, and like domesticated beyond endurance, and life had been turned upside down by fatherhood and the limitations it was putting on me. And so that was a brand new direction. It's quite a common trajectory for comedians to make, but obviously you bring your own sort of unique voice to it if you've got anything to offer. But it was enough to break that kind of thread. And then again, recent now, my kids are 12 and 15, and I think it would be kind of tiresome to still be blaming them for everything that's wrong, you know. So you have to kind of go again. Where am I going to go? And you think, well, is it going to be like slightly more political? And I think in a way, in the last 3 or 4 years, not even necessarily consciously, but I've been sort of drawn into exasperation with the culture war stuff, you know, the endless, you know, using the right pronouns and all that kind of nonsense. Do you know what I mean? That sort of
Peterson as well, yeah.
Yeah, and I found a sort of new lease of life with that. So that's kind of more where my shtick is at now, in a way, I suppose. And that changes again, you know. And so it's all just about, you know, finding out where your head really is at and not allowing a persona, which is really like a mask and doesn't change with time. You know, that will just stay on, if you allow it, that will just stay on your face forever as a comedian. And unless you rip it off and kind of go, actually, underneath this, I have changed and moved on. Yeah. And it's time that my comedy reflected that. Otherwise, you just remain sort of frozen in time, you know.
Yeah, like pigeonholed or just that kind of thing. Yeah, because and recently you were just basically brought in as a consultant to talk about right wing and left wing comedy and how comedy
on the Radio 4 thing.
Yeah, or pretty much on loads of other stuff. On
well, that's right. I think because a lot of people perceive, I think that happened with Brexit. That was an aspect of Brexit that might be just like quite sort of isolated and probably not most people's biggest takeaway from the whole thing. But it was suddenly apparent that I think for years there hadn't been anyone had gone, oh, comedians are all left wing, but suddenly all comedians were Remain. And It was really, because that was a massive divide in Britain. It was really obvious, you know, in a way that previously, if you'd done stand-up political topical comedy, you took the piss out of the government and you took the piss out of opposition, and it was like the whole process. But now suddenly everyone was just taking the piss out of Farage. Everyone was taking the piss out of Gammons, you know, or whatever. And it was very one-sided. And that just really became apparent. And when they actually won the vote, and you were thinking like the BBC it's got nothing to offer half the country. Clearly, it's just regards them as idiots, you know.
Doing it wrong. What else are we going to talk about? Hang on. Well, I've got some stuff. Have
you got people watching this live as a stream? Is that how it works?
Yeah, they're live in the group now. Let me see. So there's 11 people watching, but you know.
And then you put it up on YouTube afterwards, do you?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's in the members group, and then
Right. Okay.
Anyone got any questions? Fire them in.
Yeah. Are they all Hove people? Are they Brighton and Hove people?
Oh yeah, they're all members at the gym. So,
yeah. Right. Okay.
So right around back here. Jordan Peterson.
Yeah. Interesting character. I was very impressed. I discovered Peterson before he was famous. Not like right from the word, not like before he was famous at all. Obviously, I found him on YouTube. I didn't like find him in Vancouver or whatever, like in 1987. But I was really into listening to. He put up a load of like psychology lectures, just literally his lecture room in Toronto University, and I didn't even know about him being the sort of the embattled, anti-trans kind of lobby sort of persona thing. But he was like he was just a really intelligent, intense communicator. He's got this extraordinary style, his high-pitched, strangulated voice, this quite sort of gaunt figure prowling up and down in a medium-sized lecture theatre. It suddenly, came in through on YouTube. And I found it really compelling. And I watch a lot of that kind of stuff. And I like those kind of interesting conversations about Jung and stuff. So I just watched a lot of that. And then gradually he sort of rose and became more and more controversial. And because I'd known him for some time, I was quite in his corner. I found myself defending him more and more, aggressive attacks, on this kind of supposed patriarch, and he wants enforced monogamy, and what does that mean exactly, and all this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
And then when he had that, I don't know if you watched it, that famous interview with Cathy Newman on Channel 4 News, they gave him half an hour, and she obviously regarded him as just some sort of a redneck who'd been put into a suit for the purpose, and I mean, they always put that on YouTube, watch Jordan Peterson destroy, but he really did. He absolutely, I've never seen a more catastrophic dismantling of a news anchor on a mainstream British TV show. And Channel 4 had to pretend afterwards that she was suffering online abuse because everyone was just laughing at her. They weren't abusing her at all. They were just going, he absolutely slaughtered you, It was hilarious. But now, of course, he's had a very unfortunate, set of, I mean, he's become addicted to antidepressants and couldn't find the medical treatments that he felt were appropriate. I believe he's been put into a medically induced coma in Russia, which for some reason he thought it would be a more appropriate place. And his daughter is a weird one as well. She's an odd, individual anyway, and a bit of a media player. And I think you might know this guy. Is she not at least with, if not married to, what's his name, Cobra Tate or something, like some cage fighting guy?
Is she? Some
guy who's like had a big Twitter page and then got thrown off, but he's basically this guy who does loads of photo shoots of himself with Ferraris and like wannabe Bond girls and stuff. And he's a cage fighter. He's all like this. Anyway, he's, and he's and that's his daughter, is with this guy. So there's some odd questions about his outcomes. I think he's on the way back, but I don't think he'll ever be playing the O2 again for a long time, which is where he was at. I mean, him and Sam Harris, chaired by Douglas Murray, 3 full-on bona fide intellectuals, by normal standards anyway, actually selling out the O2. It was unbelievable. There was a brief glimmer there of a very agreeable future, I thought, and then it got,
I mean, another opiate addict. Yeah. No. Again, everything he said is just like, I could totally agree with that. And then you read the book and the way he rips down the Bible, and it's just like, they didn't teach me this at Catholic school. If only they taught. Yeah, so smart too.
Did you go to Catholic school? Was that Catholic school? Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't have any real sort of religious teaching, but I do find he is very interesting when he talks about the Bible and myth. He gets that. There's a guy called Joseph Campbell who you can see online as well, and who wrote a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. That's like one of the big sellers of comparative mythology and religion. I think a lot of Peterson's stuff comes from that. Yeah. And it's very, very interesting, all the different myths around the world have sort of certain core elements that repeat endlessly, and that teaching you basically the opposite of Polonius. You yourself have to go into the belly of the beast, and, you have to take the risk and slay the dragon. There's a limit to how much advice you can be given on these matters.
Yeah. That's how I teach religion to my kids. Like he's only 7. I was like, imagine you didn't have science, you didn't know what lightning was. What would you say? If they said, right, you're going to get a lightning bolt up your ass if you're not good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it does feel like, I mean, coronavirus is very interesting from that point of view, because I think humanity is prone to that kind of magical thinking. It will be not thinking God has done this to punish us, but we have strayed from the path in some way. Yeah. There is definitely that feeling. I know a lot of people, I know there's that fear of appearing racist, but a lot of people are going, what, you were eating what?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Thanks, globalization, for hooking us up with fucking bat soup eating people. I mean, that was great. So there is that kind of quasi Old Testament sort of vengeance is mine. Saith, have you heard of Gnon? It's a nice expression, God of nature, or nature, Gnon. Right. It's just like a theory that says you don't really need to decide ultimately, overcome the atheist question whether there is a God. There is nature who has these laws, and if you break these laws, ultimately punishment and retribution will not limp, so it doesn't really matter whether you want a personal God or whether you just want
that's Einstein's God, right? It's pretty much science and nature.
Yeah, exactly, that's right, the one who doesn't play dice. That's it.
Yeah. So hang on, how long's that concept been around? Because that sounds like it was just invented for coronavirus.
Well, I came across it on Twitter. There's an account I like very much called the Wrath of Non. Wrath as in anger, of Non, Gnon. But he isn't moral particularly. He runs a Tumblr account in which he puts some great sayings of sort of traditionalist thinkers like G.K. Chesterton or whatever over oil paintings for nice effect. But most of his Twitter is actually about what's called good urbanism, which is basically creating urban spaces that encourage people to walk and cycle instead of becoming like LA, which I also very strongly endorse and support. But he's more focused on traditional architecture, vernacular street patterns, and as against top-down urban planning, which just tends to be a nightmare, and horrible red brick libraries and things.
Yeah, but how's that going to be practical? Do you know what I mean, with like overpopulation on this scale, right?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting. You should read. I mean, I wouldn't want to paraphrase him. You should read some of his stuff. But the thing about it is that's interesting is we have a lot of land actually in the world. I mean, even in this country, which we think of as one of the most crowded islands, there's still a lot of space. It's just how you arrange that space, and the ability to farm it more efficiently now as well helps. But you don't need to build tower blocks just to cram everyone in. I mean, nobody wants everywhere to be like Hong Kong, but it really doesn't need to be. You can have well-built terraces. You look at the new town in Edinburgh, where they're 5 or 6 stories high at most, but Georgian terraces, beautifully designed around squares and curving crescents and so on. Georgian architecture, George Playfair, his name was, and it's just beautiful. But it's quite. I mean, it's quite utilitarian in a way. It's brick built and it's high, and it's it's not kind of like Tudor Beetham or kind of arts and crafts or anything. It's big slabs of granite, but it packs people in. But nobody ever feels like they're living in a non-human scale, and you can walk everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area for. It's something more people should think about and get involved in. It's like the kind of level of politics at which a lot of stuff starts, because it's when you put people into badly organized urban places that crime and alienation and dysfunction of one kind or another start to build up. And I mean, in Brighton and Hove, luckily enough, we've got some. It's pretty manageable. It's pretty livable, isn't it, by most standards? I think it's not too bad, but. You only have to go somewhere that isn't. Most of the new towns that have been built since the and feel the way the life force just drains away from you.
Nice. So we got on to coronavirus. So we're talking about like how is the universe getting its own back, or.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, that makes it sound very personal. I just think we have transgressed. But equally, of course, the thing you have to remember is like. We think of like progress. I'm always like watching the screen because I'm in mirror, but we think of progress as going up. You know what I mean? Like an exponential curve going up. I can't do it. It's impossible because the screen's a mirror. Like the opposite. But yeah, it goes up at an angle. Whereas in reality, it goes in. Do you know what I mean? It's like you roughly goes up, but it's more like a bee, like flying around. Sometimes it surges up, sometimes it falls back and crosses itself. And we're going to be going into a loop now. There's going to be a loop. We're going to go back a few years in terms of wealth and productivity, and we don't know how many years we're going to have to live with this virus. We think that there may be a vaccine, but then again, our experience of coronavirus in the past, there are many of them which remain endemic, which is to say you never get rid of them because they mutate just enough, or the the immunity doesn't last very long. We don't really know what the future is in that respect. We're going to have to probably make significant adaptations to how we live. It's not a question of sitting tight while the scientists sort it out. We may well be emerging into a permanently different sort of world, which is not to say I don't think one in which, keeping fit or laughing won't be an issue. I'm hoping there'll be some sort of basis for us as a professional. It might be that people are wearing masks in comedy clubs for the next 5 years, maybe just indefinitely. I mean, I've played in comedy clubs in Beijing and Shanghai and Hong Kong where they do wear masks. They just all go out in masks.
Yeah.
The Chinese much more. The English expats, of course, who come to the shows, less so. But it's a cultural thing that we might just have to overcome. With my massive big old schnoz, I'm going to be in trouble because there's always a lot of there's a lot of air gets down the side when I wear a mask.
Yeah, on the wire that goes.
It's going to be all right. Yeah.
Yeah.
What you'd always thought of as an unfortunate incident might be the saving of you.
So actually, now because I've got you on, you're probably the person with his, what's the word, ear to the thingy, the political scene more than anyone I've spoken to recently.
Okay.
You don't think it was a chemical weapon? You don't think anything to do with China or getting trade deals with Trump, or basically all just selling masks to the rest of the world?
No conspiracy theories of that sort, no deliberate release. I think it was more likely to have emerged from a lab than from the food market, but I think they were investigating it in a lab because they were aware that the tendency to eat things as they say, have a reservoir of viruses in them, which is this fantastic word. They know that people eat bats. They know that they eat pangolins and God knows what else. They know that these viruses exist. I think my guess, if I had to, put my money down right now on how it happened, they were investigating these viruses because they're aware that an animal to human transmission would be possible, in fact, likely at some point, largely due to the fact that they are regarded as a luxury or even just, slightly odd staple food. And so it doesn't really matter whether it came from the market or from the lab in moral terms, if you like, because the lab wouldn't have had to investigate it if the markets weren't already selling it. But I suspect it was security in the lab which was at fault. But I certainly don't think that anyone was developing it as a biological weapon, because I think it would just be too untamable, too random. I mean, China, obviously does have the capacity to lock its people down and to treat its people with a good deal more contempt, frankly, than Western liberal democracies do. But it still would be an incredibly blunt weapon to try and bring to bear, because apart from anything else, it's mainly an economic weapon, really, and because it's going to devastate economies rather than. I mean, it only has even if its death toll were as high as 5%, that isn't really enough to, and even then, most of them are already the elderly, I mean, the Spanish flu would have been a much more useful biological weapon because it wiped out fighting age young men. I mean, it was incredibly targeted at men, in the prime of life. That was the horrible thing with the Spanish flu. Most of the mortality was men who had recently returned home from the war.
Right.
But not most of it, but a large part of it. Whereas with this, it's clearly heavily weighted towards your 70 and 80-year-olds. And to be brutally honest, if you wanted to damage the society, that's the worst thing you can do. I mean, if you take away the moral and the sort of emotional impact of it, it would be of huge benefit to the West if you were trying to wipe out their pensioners. That would be an immensely beneficial effect, on the Western economies if all of its economically unproductive people were wiped out at a single stroke by a virus. There'd be a few years of mourning, and then everyone would go, "Oh my God, this is amazing! We are all just only feeding ourselves now." So that would be a bad weapon. I don't think the Chinese would be, but I don't think they were thinking those terms anyway. I do think it was probably lab security that was to blame, though, rather than the wet market itself. That's my suspicion. But I have a few links and stuff I can send you that are fairly, well-grounded, dry researched evidence to support that. But it's really interesting as well how it works, and I think this is one of the reasons that French Nobel awarded chemist, but a bit of a crank nevertheless, says that he thought it was a bioweapon because it contains SNPs of HIV that are so perfectly replicated it couldn't have happened by coincidence, that he thought it was an attempt to basically combine the common cold and HIV, to create a sort of easily transmittable airborne version of AIDS. But that seems unlikely. But it is extraordinary how it works, because they still don't really know quite what the mechanism is by which it makes you feel ill. Initially, it was thought to be like pneumonia, but that's a disease of the lungs. And in fact, they say most people's lungs are in not bad state, but their blood seems unable to transport oxygen around their body. That's what happens. It's more like oxygen. It's more like altitude sickness.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there's some kind of suggestion that it somehow manages to detach the iron in your hemoglobin from the red blood cells, which makes your red blood cells unable to do their job, which is extraordinarily sinister way for it to,
Yeah.
When you start reading that, you do kind of go, you little tight, you cunning little tight. But, too easy to personalize.
Yeah. Oh, cool. That's a good answer. I'm happy with that answer for an educated opinion on coronavirus. So let's talk about something completely stupid now.
Okay.
Celebrity culture.
Yeah.
Did you? I don't know. Maybe watch it for research. SAS, the SAS series. Do you ever watch that?
Is that Ant Middleton?
Yeah.
I'm aware who he is. I've seen his posters up, and I saw him giving the middle finger to the coronavirus and then walking that back a bit 48 hours later.
Yeah.
I believe he's got like a tour of Earl's Court and what have you coming up, isn't he? I think he's actually playing the Brighton Centre, which I do remember thinking, how can he play the Brighton Centre and I struggle to sell out the Comedia? What is he going to do? What are people thinking they're going to hear?
It's like what you talk about on Twitter. It's like the dumbing down or the market, and then there's I saw him at Worthing in his first tour when it was a bit smaller. When he was doing places like Worthing, now it's but he loses a lot of respect for him. So he's ex SBS, Special Boat Squadron, and
his boat, is he? Right, okay.
Yeah. So he was Army, maybe even Navy, then Marines, and then SBS, and then did some tours and stuff. So he's a legit soldier. But yeah, and he wrote a book, obviously co-written with someone, and he does this stuff.
That SAS literature genre has been around for a long time now, isn't it? Was it Bravo 20 was probably the start of it? Right?
Yeah, about the Gulf War.
How much more can there be to say about these? I suppose every new, generation wants its new SAS hero. But
I mean, he's not writing about any of his stuff like any of his tours. He's just writing about the lessons he learned from it and applying it to life. So it's very digestible. It's quite interesting. It's all good.
I'm not totally against that. He doesn't strike me as the sort of bloke that he's got a lot of bravado about him, hasn't he? Which I just find slightly tiresome. But have you ever heard of a guy called Sebastian Junger?
No.
He wrote The Perfect Storm, which was they made into a movie with George Clooney about a boat caught in the eye of a hurricane, and then it was an amazing film. I didn't read the book of that, but he's most famous for war correspondence. He's spent a lot of time in Afghanistan with American troops. He's written a couple of books. One was called War. The best one is called Tribe, which is quite short, but it's like an investigation of the psychology which he thinks explains post-traumatic stress disorder when you get home from Afghanistan and you've done your missions and you're no longer on patrols and instead you're just holed up in some flat, in a suburb. And he says it's nothing to do with the the memory of being shot at or whatever, or what the damage that was done to you. It's quite the opposite. It's how good life was then, because you were part of a team that relied on you, and this is what men need. You were part of a squad, and you had each other's backs, and everyone when you went on patrol expected you to do your duty and to be reliable. And when you were reliable and you went home and everyone had survived, that was a good feeling. And when you go through the day, once it's over and you're back on the streets of wherever your hometown is, and nobody relies on you or gives a damn either way, that's when the stress disorder kicks in. And he gives different examples throughout history about demonstrating that this is what people need. And one extraordinary one was the statistics about the early settlers in America. He said that both sides, the Europeans and the Indians, or whatever you want to call them, the Cherokee and the Sioux, what have you, would capture each other's hostages if they could, and hold them sometimes for years. In every single case, if you captured a Cherokee or a Sioux or whatever, the Europeans would hold him. As soon as he was able to do so, he would go back to his own people. He would struggle endlessly and relentlessly to escape, like a World War II prisoner, British prisoner in a camp. It would never be domesticated. But in numerous cases, if a European was taken by a Cherokee, after only a few weeks, he would adapt to the new lifestyle and would very often refuse. Even if his own people came for him, he would refuse to leave and go back to live in the European style society, because he had found so much more meaning and connection and like so much more emotional support and food. Life made so much more sense in the tribal society that he had been inducted into,
right.
Despite obviously lack of any sort of modern conveniences. You know. Really, really excellent book. Very interesting, and much less kind of macho than this Ant Middleton stuff, I think. You know.
Yeah, that sounds cool. Yeah. I was at college with a Marine, and he was paralysed from the waist down. He left the Marines and then was doing the skydiving whatever show, and a civvy crashed into him on the way down and sent him into free fall, and he was paralysed. But he would chat about Civvy Street. It's like people don't get it. He's like, you know, when he came out of service, he's walking around just like exactly that. It's like Civvy Street with such disregard, such taste, like just that phrase. Yeah, you don't get it.
I think any experience that heightens your emotions and your awareness, you know, that heightens your senses afterwards, ordinarily, I mean, don't have to go into the army. You look at surfers, you know, we get some on the south coast here, but certainly there's like communities where it's more reliable, where it's all they live for. And they just exist between surfing. They have no interest in anything else, because once you have learned to tame and harness the power of the waves, and once you can ride one of those things, nothing else compares to that, you know. And you get turned over and you wipe out or whatever, and you might come in with a hideous, you know, rash, and you will go back out there as soon as you can, because it's living at more extreme. In a tiny way, when I first started doing stand-up, I would have that feeling of like, it was, you know, because you overcome a fear of humiliation, you know, and if you get the first few times you get away with it, you know, and you still get a bit nervous, but it's nothing like that same level now. But the first few times you go out there, it gets addictive really quickly, because you want to live, you want to feel that fear and then overcome it again. You know, that is really how life should be lived for, I think, men of, you know, of fighting age men anyway. That, you know, those are there should be 10 or 15 years in your life where you're basically confronting significant fears, whether or not they're well founded, and overcoming them, you know.
Using abilities, and
that's what I try and get my, you know, I've got a 12-year-old son now, and he's just started, his room has just started to stink. He's going through that process. I've been waiting, drumming my fingers, come on. And finally he's hit it. The puberty, the aroma of puberty is now when I go in there. But, you know, so I'm really, I mean, he's up for it. He's really into tree climbing and stuff like that. And it's about pushing him, you know, go that extra branch, you know. Yeah. And if he takes a couple of broken bones on the way, then that would be a price worth paying, because it is how you create character, I think. Yeah,
because that's it. Because again, whether it's an extreme sport, whether it's MMA or surfing or whatever, motocross, that's ridiculous. Yeah. Well, what if you die? And I don't care.
No, that's right. What if I don't die or live?
Yeah,
that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what if you die? Who cares? Yeah, so and that's it, because you're so into that. Or let's say it's the tribes, like we're going out hunting buffalo, whatever cliche we're going to use, saber-tooth tiger. So what if you die? It's like, yeah, that's what we do.
If I don't do this, I would be disgraced, you know, and that would be worse. We still have the fear of disgrace. In fact, in a way, as a stand-up, that's what the fear is: the fear of being disgraced and being cast out of the tribe. You know, as a result, you know, that's kind of what you're afraid of, really. But even though it's obviously, I've never had a gig that was so bad.
I was going to say on that note, what's the nature of
It's hard to find out what a good rite of passage is now, though, whether I have to sort of tie some vines around his ankle and chuck him out of a tree, or, you know, we spend a night in the jungle or something. I don't know what we have to do to go through into that manhood thing. But there are books written about this, I dare say. Yeah,
and there's small cults in the States. What's that guy? Order of Man. Ryan Nicola. Have you come across him?
Say it again.
Ryan Nicola. He's called. It's got a thing called the Order of Man. He's just a bit thick. He's a devout Christian, which is fine, and he practices faith. But he talks about, probably you've heard about the 5 things of the body, mind, the soul, and the whatever in the brain. Do you know what I mean? So like, you've got to do something physical, you've got to meditate, you've got to learn, and you've got to keep the faith. And if you've got these four or five things covered in your life, then you're okay. basically trying to find lost souls. And lots of life coaches, be it Anthony Robbins or whoever, have all come across to the same thing. Who's that other guy? Darren White, another one. Anyway, just selling the solution to men, to lost men.
I have seen one guy that's quite, I can't remember his name now. He has a book called things like The Way of Man or something. And he's a big fella with a big bushy beard, but he's gay, and he's quite out and gay, but he's extraordinarily traditionally masculine as well. And this seems to have helped his sort of USP as well. I can't remember what his name is. Oh, God. Can't remember. There's loads of them. I know it is a big, a few years ago, there was that one, Iron John. Did you ever see that? That was, Robert Bly, his name was, and he's like a highly regarded poet. So he was kind of bringing in again the whole sort of old mythology type stuff to bear on it. But his was basically about stripped to the waist and get into the woods, and reconnect.
Yeah. Initiate the boy, or he'll burn the village.
Yeah, that's good. There's some truth to it, though. Although there's always a grain of truth, and there's also, I think it's fine to do it and also take the piss out of it at the same time. It's fine to do it, to take it seriously, and also to sort of mock it and see how crazy it is. Because the trouble is, as the guy I mentioned earlier, Campbell, in one of his talks, Joseph Campbell, he says the trouble with our society is it's moving so fast, it changes so quickly, that it's very hard for us to create heroes and stories and myths that reflect the reality we live in time. By that time, it's changed. So we have to go back to Odysseus, whatever, and slaying the Minotaur and stuff like that, because those are ancient myths, but they came from a time where life didn't change from 100 years to the next, So you could build up this understanding of what life was. Whereas, if you created a myth in the 1960s about what life was like, or how a man should be if he wants to create a family and what virtues he should have to attract women, already it would be out of date. Already that would look dated in a way that, Homer or whatever doesn't now.
It is, right? Like the idea of, the husband and wife unit in the 50s or 60s compared to... Yeah.
Exactly. And movies reflected that. And Jack Lemmon, movies, he was like presented as the everyman. Well, now he just looks like nobody's like that, wearing a suit and a hat and going off to a massive office and selling insurance. Literally nobody does that anymore, That's 50 years ago. He looks more dated than Brad Pitt does in Troy,
Yeah. Boom. Cool. I was reading Heracles actually in the 12 Tasks of Heracles.
Right.
And I read it to my kid who's loving it. And it was I think it was after the fourth task, like he gets set a harder task each time. It's like clean the stables, kill this beast, kill the lion, do this. And it just says like there's 2 lines of self-help. It's like, and with every task that Heracles did, he got more confident and more fearless. So he didn't care what the next thing they threw at him was. And like he's facing the fear and doing it and getting addicted to that. And it's just that was Hercules. Just like, give it to me, whatever. I did that.
It's the earliest story, and it's always the same. It's always the same moral at the heart of these things. Confront it, go through, come out stronger. Yeah, it's good stuff. I haven't read it to my son. I remember when we went to Greece about 3 or 4 years ago. Funny enough, Morocco's, that restaurant and ice cream place on the seafront. There was one of the waiters in there was from a part of Greece, Pelion, I think it was called. And my wife was very fond of him, a little too fond, if you ask me. But anyway, she chatted to him and decided we'd go there for the holiday. And it's where the centaurs lived in Greek mythology, And so we read a lot of Greek mythology, and I got some of the, the classic translations or anthologies. Robert Graves, who wrote I, Claudius, wrote a great collection of them. And we read some of this stuff out, and what they loved about it, of course, was it's absolutely fucking filthy, The centaurs. Here's how the centaur. I can't remember all the names, but this is the story of how the centaurs came to be. Zeus had a wife, Hera, her name was, right, and he was very jealous of her, obviously, even though he himself was often having affairs with God knows who else all the time. But he was very angry if anyone looked at Hera twice. Yeah. One of the kings of Greece, a mortal man, went up to Olympus to beg Zeus to intercede or intervene in some dispute he was having. And while he was there, Zeus became convinced that he fancied Hera, this king. So in order to tempt the king and see if he would fall for it, Zeus creates out of cloud a sort of simulacrum of Hera, a sort of just like an avatar. She looks exactly the same, but she has no internal. And sure enough, this king seduces this cloud form like dummy of Hera, and And Zeus catches him in the act and binds him to a wheel of fire and sends him spinning off through eternity. So he gets his punishment. Meanwhile, however, this avatar of Hera, which Zeus has created, and it says in the book, despite being more form than substance, it's beautiful, isn't it? Falls pregnant by the king somehow, with whom she's had an affair, and gives birth to this monstrous child who is part king and part whatever this Hera was, this form, substanceless Hera. He is immediately by Zeus cast out of Olympus as obviously, persona non grata and all kinds of unpleasant memories, and goes down to earth. He's sexually insatiable. He runs around fucking horses, and they then give birth to the centaurs, and that's where the centaurs come from. And I was reading this out to my kids. I mean, Edward was about 7 at the time, and I was like, I'm not sure. Do I stop at this point?
And it's on the hoof there. It's like, wow. Amazing. See, it's relatable to today.
Now. I don't care how incredible your imagination. You would struggle to beat that, I think.
Yeah. But again, I'm sure there's plenty of those in Sussex, like people that love horses that much.
Get off my land.
Yeah. Did you see that picture from Brighton Beach yesterday?
I didn't see one yesterday. Were there a lot of them on there, or?
No. There's 2 people having sex at 7:50 a.m. Just down from the Odeon, and all the comments.
Oh my god!
Distancing, or yeah.
Just to let you know, mate, I'm going to have to wind it up in a couple of minutes. Is that all right?
Yes, absolutely fine. Yeah. I don't know if anyone's got any questions, anything, or what we were talking about. So, what's your worst ever gig? So, talk about dying on your ass or becoming the
worst ever gig. The one I remember as being the worst. I don't know if it was the worst in reality, but it was the sort of feedback afterwards. I do corporates, and most of them, my corporates go pretty well. That's why you get paid quite a lot for corporates, and I made it a bit of a specialisation because it pays well, and I quite enjoy them. They tend to be an audience of well-dressed, intelligent people who've done well in their jobs, and I quite like that as an audience. Other comedians somehow, for some reason, find it, they'd rather have a, the sort of classic pub, sort of stale beer kind of environment. I'm in the ballroom at the Hilton Park Lane. I'm like, that's fine, I can handle it. But anyway, one of them went badly. It was the Bookseller Awards. So it was like bookshops, basically, but bookshops and book warehouses. And I think they were all a bit miffed anyway, because the vast majority of books, it turned out, are now sold either obviously on Amazon or in like Tesco. Tesco, if you can get onto the shelves in Tesco, you sell vastly more than you can through Waterstones, let alone the independents. Yeah. And so that whole sense of like the bookshop, the bookseller, a world, a culture, a skill, a craft, a tradition, that's all being sort of swept away a little bit. And I sensed quite, as the evening wore on, quite a sort of grouchy, bitter sort of mood in the crowd. But clearly, somehow, I also managed to misjudge it. I don't know what. I think there were a couple of jokes I made early on about Brighton hen parties or something that they didn't like particularly. Right. And anyway, I sort of lost the crowd. What you normally do about 10 or 15 minutes of comedy, and then over the course of presenting the awards, you drop jokes in as well, and you have a bit of banter with people who come up on the stage. And those gigs were after the first 2 or 3 awards, I was like, let's just get through this because the banter was just really... But all of that happens once in a while, it's fair enough. But then I made the mistake of checking Twitter on the way home. And because they're booksellers, they were all complaining to each other how much they hadn't liked the comedian and how bad he misjudged it and stuff. And that is the one thing about living in Brighton. If you live in London, you go home after the gig, you just get home, you have a brief... But if you do a gig in London and you've then got an hour and a half, on the train checking Twitter for company as the night drags on and on, then you're just getting bad reviews coming in. Not good for the soul. Yeah. No.
So losing the crowd, not. Is there
I've never had a gig, not for years anyway, where I totally died on my arse, because you're a professional, you know roughly how to play a room, but there is that sense sometimes that they're sort of enduring you rather than enjoying you.
Yeah.
They make decisions very early on, and of course that as a comedian, and that's part of the skill. You have to hit the ground running. You have to come in and claim your territory very quickly, and reassure them that you are to be trusted. That this is a joke, and and if you say something offensive, there's a wink, and it's offensive. You haven't just blundered into it or whatever. There has to be all of that kind of just reassurance, just the upholstery really that they can relax into.
Yeah, nice. Cool. Right, well, I'm going to let you go because thank you so much for coming on, dude.
Absolute pleasure. Pop it up on YouTube, won't you, and send me a link, and I'll stick it on the Twitter and all that. I always share these things out.
Oh, brilliant, cool. Thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you soon once all the madness is over.
I hope so, Alec. Yeah, take care. Weather the storm, fella.
You too, man. Cheers, Simon.
Take care. All the best. Bye bye.